Hi, everyone. I just would firstly like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I honour elders and ancestors who have always cared for this place we call Maribyrnong and all who lived here. And I acknowledge the wisdom of country and what the seasons teach us, and that the impacts of climate disruption are a form of colonialism. And it was so nice to turn up today, actually, because I realised that I reckon I know about at least 60% of people in the room, maybe a little higher. So I'm feeling both comfortable, but also just a little nervous. So as Trent said, I've been a councillor at Maribyrnong since November 2020. I was partly elected on a climate action platform. And before I was elected, I spent 12 years working with some people who are in the room on climate change and environment projects at Hume City Council. But also, I grew up in the middle of coal country in Singleton in the New South Wales Hunter Valley. So I know how difficult it is to have conversations about anything to do with climate, not using the language climate emergency, but just even raising the issue of getting out of coal and getting into renewables. So I've had some very interesting Christmas conversations, shall we say, with my family and who a number of them worked in the mines or the mining industry. So, but it's incredibly important to have those conversations when you can, and to, you know, choose your words carefully, because it's in that context, it's a very, very personal issue for people who are invested, or whose lives are kind of, the context of their lives is, you know, happens within a fossil fuel kind of context and a fossil fuel community. So as you heard earlier, in early 2019, Maribyrnong, and I'll read the words, acknowledged that we are in a state of climate emergency that requires urgent action by all levels of government, unquote. So this was achieved by a campaign by the community, a small but focused group who lobbied the then council and joined hundreds of other jurisdictions who had themselves declared a climate emergency. And it's not really clear to me why they chose the word acknowledge and not declare, or if there's a difference. I did look the words up, but I couldn't quite, you know, tell whether there was any significant difference. But I do think that language matters when we're communicating the climate emergency ideas and information. What we say and how we say it is important in communicating not only that sense of emergency, but also how we as a council will respond and when we'll respond. And so today I've kind of taken the approach of communication as action. You know, there's the saying that actions speak louder than words, and also because our communities are consistently asking us to act. So for me, the way I act is just as important as what I say. So I've kind of combined those two things. So council delivers hundreds of services for the community as a service provider or as a partner with the community. And there's a lot of competition for space to promote action, to provide information, to engage and inspire the community, and also to report back what is happening. But we must be consistent in our communications, because when we're silent for the community, that can be read as no action. So, or at least that's what the community can be led to think. If they're heavily invested in action and activism, they might think, well, why haven't I heard anything about that EV charger? Maybe it's not going ahead. And if they're less invested, that might lead them to think, well, council doesn't actually care about what's happening in the climate space, so I don't have to do anything either. So climate communications, as far as I can tell, are an ongoing long-term project. It takes time and it takes resources. And it's not like a communications campaign to encourage pet registrations, which is specific, short, and has a very clear call to action. Bring your dog in, get it registered by a certain date. Talking about the climate emergency to an already busy, worried, overworked, anxious and climate concerned community is complex, because the issue, as we know, itself is complex. And in that noisy and increasingly fractured communications landscape, our opportunities to connect and talk to communities about the climate emergency are becoming increasingly limited. So that feels a little bit doom and gloom. But I think there is space for particularly those of us who are councillors, but also for officers working in local government. You'll find your way through, but I'm kind of talking from a councillor perspective here. So the first thing I think you need to do is ask questions. whatever forum you're at, whether it's in the council chamber, at the ALGA National Conference, at the MAV, at community forums, where state and federal MPs are at, ask questions of decision makers and let them know that it's an issue that you and your community care about, and that collectively we want action from those people. It's important to join the dots. As you heard earlier, in 2022, Maribyrnong was impacted by the floods, and we had about 500 people who lost their homes as a result. And it was talked about as not as a climate-related disaster, but as a natural disaster. And again, here language matters. And while we don't want to add any additional anxiety to the people affected, using specific language opens up a conversation about climate, perhaps for a later date, but it also puts what happened in a climate context. We need to be strategic with our decisions and our thinking and our actions. So seeing the climate element in everything we do, if we're looking at infrastructure plans, if we're looking at budgets, if we're looking at strategy and policies. And Maribyrnong's budget for the last couple of years has had a climate emergency statement in there, which clearly outlines for our community where our dollars are going in relation to climate response. And we need to allocate resources, the right ones at the right level: technical, community engagement, strategic, networking. And in 2019, when Maribyrnong acknowledged the climate emergency, I think we had 2 staff having to do absolutely everything on climate, environment, biodiversity, whatever. And now we have, I think, 4, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 5 wonderful staff, a dedicated manager and department working across all elements of climate and environment. And we can see the difference that that has made in our organisation and in how our organisation works with and supports the community. And that's a good segue, because the next idea I have is supporting the community, working out who is leading the community response. And in Maribyrnong, now I'm going to just get a little parochial. I'm going to give a big shout out to some people in the room. We have Climate Action Maribyrnong, Parents for Climate Action Bike West, Critical Mass has a few rides here. We have Permaculture Out West. We have a Maribyrnong Youth Advisory Group, which is heavily focused on climate change, and the Maidstone Community Centre. They're all working across the community in various ways to raise the issue of climate emergency and to lobby council. I've got 48 seconds. I'm nearly there. But meet with those people, help them to navigate council processes. That's really important for where resources and budget and policy gets directed. Amplify their voices in the council chamber, on social media, when you're going to events. Attend their events, because by doing this, you're communicating your support directly to them, but you're also signalling to other people that this is important work. And the last 2, provide opportunities for climate champions to talk about climate emergency, but I think most importantly is listen. And we heard those fantastic videos. Listen to the voices of young people, to climate disaster survivors, to farmers, to emergency workers, and those working to protect ecosystems from the onslaught of climate change. And I think if we can do that, we can kind of fit into the radical collaboration and the something optimism, which I think is, for me, the best framing for how we can talk to people about climate change in our communities. Thank you.